Almost every aspect of our lives are all transported by ship. In fact, some 80% of international trade by volume is conducted by boat. If something were to stop the ships from sailing, then we'd be in trouble. That's exactly what the Houthis, the armed group that controls most of Yemen, are trying to do. And they're succeeding. Major companies around the world are bowing to Houthi pressure. They're hiring armed guards, turning off their ship trackers, or even taking alternate routes that add days onto their journeys. But now the U.S., the largest and most powerful country in the world, has announced the formation of a task force of 10 nations in order to deal with this threat to international trade. You might be wondering what the fuss is all about. After all, the Houthis are a terribly impoverished guerrilla force, backed pretty much only by Iran. They have no naval forces to speak of. Surely the U.S., which has the most powerful navy in world history, and 9 of its allies who themselves rank among the world's most powerful nations, will make quick work of this armed group and its attacks on commercial ships. Unfortunately, things are more complicated than that. Behind the impressive threats, the U.S. task force is riddled with weaknesses. Is it merely a paper tiger? Will the richest armed forces in the world really fail to stop one of the poorest from attacking civilian vessels? What side is the world on? The answers to these questions might surprise you. Things are far more complicated than they might first appear. Before we discuss the attacks, let's investigate the task force put together by the U.S. First, recall that America is practically a task force in itself. The U.S. still undoubtedly has the world's strongest navy, with 11 aircraft carriers and dozens of destroyers. It far outmatches any other nation. The power disparity between this monstrous force and that fielded by the Houthi. This is almost laughable. In fact, it almost couldn't be larger. The Houthi movement is nothing to laugh at in itself, but it basically doesn't have a navy. In other words, the U.S. could enjoy almost total supremacy over the waters without the need for any allies at all. Still, playing the world's policeman doesn't always make you the most popular. It's good to show that you can unite many countries behind you and your goals. That's one of the main reasons America attempted to form a coalition against the Houthi efforts in the first place. So who did it manage to convince to join? Some big names are on the list. Canada, France, Britain, Italy, the Netherlands, Spain, and Norway are all part of the task force. They're all wealthy nations, and some of them rank among the biggest military spenders. The Seychelles is also on the list of nations taking part in America's task force. That's not terribly surprising. While the country is minuscule, it's a staunch supporter of basically anything. The U.S., its main ally, does. One of the more interesting members, however, is Bahrain. Why is that interesting? You may have noticed a couple of notable absences. That is, no major Arab nations joined the U.S. coalition. No Egypt, no Saudi Arabia. Bear in mind that Saudi Arabia has been conducting a brutal military campaign against the Houthis in Yemen for years. With us support the fact that it chose not to join its allies' coalition, which aims to combat the Houthis, is fascinating. Bahrain can be seen is sort of a consolation prize for the U.S. It couldn't get any of the major players in the region to join, so it settled for Bahrain. Why didn't Egypt and Saudi Arabia join the coalition? Surely they would want to assist the U.S. in its effort to protect international shipping. This is where things get more complicated. To understand their reasoning, we need to investigate what exactly the Houthis are attempting to do. First, a bit of background. To summarize, Yemen has been racked by war for decades. Various factions have fought for control, each backed by whatever major world powers were willing to support them as part of whatever great global game was playing out at the time for almost a decade. The conflict has been between the official government of Yemen and the Houthi rebels. The official government is only official in the sense that it is recognized by pretty much the whole world. It actually spends most of its time in Saudi Arabia, which is its most important ally. The U.S. is its other most important ally. The group that actually controls most of Yemen is the Houthi rebels. Despite being only recognized by Iran and Syria, the group has successfully held off the might of Saudi Arabia, one of the world's best-funded militaries. The conflict has been gruesome and deadly, with tens of thousands of civilian lives lost nevertheless. The Houthis remain able to extend their influence internationally. They've done so in an attempt to support the people of Palestine since October 7th, when armed Palestinian militants stormed into Israel in a shock attack. Israel has conducted a brutal, devastating campaign against the occupied Palestinian territories. As of this video's production, some 20,000 Palestinian civilians have lost their lives, almost half of them children, months ago. The Houthi rebels launched multiple attacks against Israel and related targets. They publicly announced that they would continue launching missiles and drones against these targets until Israel stopped its destruction of Palestine. These attacks were largely symbolic. The missiles and drones were almost all intercepted by either Israeli or American forces. The U.S. has moved a huge Naval force into the seas near Israel. These ships are some of the most advanced in the world. They can easily deal with the cheap rockets fired by the Houthis, who rely on funding from Iran. However, the Houthis weren't going to stop there. They extended their attacks to civilian vessels linked to Israel, firing upon them and even capturing them. In November, they successfully captured a ship called the Galaxy Leader, which remains in captivity. The ship is linked to an Israeli businessman, Abraham Anger, a member of one of Israel's wealthiest families. Images released earlier in December show various people touring the ship, which has been graffitied in parts with slogans expressing support for the armed Palestinian militants currently battling Israel military targets protected by U.S. weaponry. May be able to shrug off Houthi attacks. Civilian commercial vessels are another story. As the Houthi attacks continued, operators grew more and more weary. After all, bosses had to ask their employees to risk death or indefinite imprisonment. The Houthis were clear in their reasoning. All ships connected to Israel or delivering to and from Israel were considered fair targets, but without a navy. How much damage could these militants really do? More than you might expect. You'd understand that modern naval warfare extends beyond ships. Missiles are a vitally important facet of ocean battles these days. Despite not having any significant naval forces, the Houthis' ability to use missiles and drones means they can exert significant naval influence. Their position is also key. Yemen sits at the entrance to the Red Sea, one of the most important shipping routes in the world. Ships travel through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea in order to avoid going all the way around Africa. Ship operators now had a choice: send their ship's cargo and employees into a firing range in which they were the targets, or don't. For many groups, the choice was obvious. BP, one of the world's largest petroleum companies, has paused all transit through the Red Sea. Frontline, a major oil tanker group, has also announced that its vessels would avoid the area. Maersk, a major shipping company, has announced that its ships will make longer journeys around Africa until the situation changes. The importance of these decisions can't be understated. MK alone controls some 15% of the world's liner fleet, and each trip around Africa will cost operators up to $1 million extra in fuel alone. Let alone the additional costs of paying employees and delays in shipping. The shipping company won't just absorb these costs out of the goodness of their hearts. They'll be passed on to consumers. Those in Israel will be hit hardest. The country relies heavily on seaborne trade, so the rise in shipping costs will affect many parts of life. According to Fratos, a global freight platform, the cost of shipping goods from China, the world's largest producer of many goods to Israel, has risen by about half. All these increased costs are bad. It's not even the worst thing for Israel. Some operators have stopped accepting cargo to and from Israel at all, unless the situation changes. That change is what the U.S. wants to effect with its task force. That shouldn't be hard, should it? It looks like it might be in mid-December. The U.S. officially launched Operation Prosper SEC Guardian. According to the Pentagon, More than 20 nations have signed on the idea. According to officials, is to conduct patrols in the Red Sea and nearby areas, intercepting Houthi missiles and going to the aid of ships that find themselves under attack. There are several problems with this idea. First, hundreds of commercial vehicles pass through these seas every day. It would be impossible to protect every single one of them. Second, and perhaps more importantly, the support behind this coalition is far weaker than it might seem. At first, we already discussed America's failure to get a major Arab nation on board, including the Houthis' main enemy, Saudi Arabia. Well, recent reports give the impression that even the members of the coalition are somewhat lukewarm about their support. Several made it clear that their actions were simply part of existing naval agreements rather than any sort of alliance to a new US-led operation. Italy, for example, said its front being sent to the Red Sea was not part of Operation Prosperity Guardian. It dropped out of the Force SP Spain, and France did the same. Meanwhile, the Netherlands' participation amounts to sending 2 naval officers to the region. Norway said it would send 10. Denmark will send 1 no matter how competent they are. It almost goes without saying that 13 officers are a somewhat pie force to wield against a militant group that has managed to hold off the US-supported Saudi forces for years. Operation Prosperity Guardian, in other words, is off to a shaky and confusing start. That certainly won't help it achieve its aim of calming shipping companies and protecting world trade. Nevertheless, the US appears committed to its task force. Perhaps with time, the group will be able to reduce Houthi attacks enough to convince shipping companies to risk resuming normal service. Of course, the US could also simply listen to Houthi demands and stop Israel from continuing its devastating military campaign against the Palestinians.